I knew something was wrong the second my key stopped turning in the lock, but it wasn't until I looked down that I understood just how far they had gone, because my suitcase, the same one I had packed just 5 days earlier for a quiet trip to visit an old friend, was sitting on the sidewalk like it belonged to someone who no longer had a place inside that house. The morning air was cool against my face, a soft breeze moving the loose tag on the handle back and forth, and for a moment I simply stood there on the front porch, staring at the door that had once opened without question, the door I had walked through for years without ever thinking twice about whether I was welcome. Taped neatly at eye level was a piece of white paper, the edges pressed down carefully as if this had all been planned well in advance, and I already knew before I read it that whatever was written there would not be kind. If you want to stay here, you'll follow our rules. The word "our" was underlined twice, heavy and deliberate, and I didn't need to ask who had written it because I recognized Sophie's handwriting instantly. Precise, controlled, always just a little too perfect. I didn't knock. I didn't call out. Instead, I reached into my purse and tried my key again, slower this time, as if patience might somehow change the outcome. But the lock didn't move, didn't even pretend to consider it. And that was when the truth settled quietly into my chest. They had changed the locks. Not by accident, not in a moment of anger, but deliberately, while I was gone, while I trusted them to keep things as they had always been. Across the street, Mrs. Jensen's curtains shifted just slightly, and I knew she was watching, not out of cruelty, but out of curiosity, the kind that comes when something unusual breaks the rhythm of an otherwise predictable neighborhood. I kept my back straight. I picked up the note and folded it once, then again, careful, controlled, the way I had learned to handle difficult things over a lifetime of being the one who held everything together. My phone buzzed in my hand before I even thought to check it, and when I looked down, I saw Daniel's name, my son, the boy who used to run to this very porch with scraped knees and stories he couldn't wait to tell me. "This is for the best, Mom." The message read, short and clean, like it had been rehearsed. I stared at those words longer than I had stared at the note, longer than I had stared at my suitcase sitting there in plain view for anyone to see, and something inside me shifted, not breaking, not collapsing, but sharpening. I didn't reply. I didn't knock. I didn't give them the reaction they were expecting. Instead, I reached into the side pocket of my purse, where I had kept something for years without ever needing to use it, a document I had almost forgotten about until that exact moment. And as I held it in my hands, I realized something they clearly hadn't. They thought they had locked me out of my own life. What they didn't understand yet was that they had just given me a reason to take it back. I did not remember walking away from the house, but suddenly I was sitting in my car at the end of the block, my hands still resting on the steering wheel, as if I had been driving for hours instead of just a few seconds, and the silence inside that car felt heavier than anything I had carried in years. The note was folded neatly in my lap, the paper already softening at the edges from how tightly I had held it, and for a long moment I just stared at it again, not because I needed to reread the words, but because I needed to understand how something so small could change everything so completely. "If you want to stay here, you will follow our rules." There was no greeting, no explanation, no attempt to soften the message. Just a line drawn clearly between who belonged and who did not. I thought about the last morning before my trip, how Sophie had stood in the kitchen with her coffee, speaking in that calm, measured tone she always used when she wanted something to sound reasonable. She had mentioned space. She had mentioned boundaries. She had even smiled when she said it, as if we were having a polite conversation instead of a quiet negotiation I had not realized I was part of. Daniel had barely looked up from his phone that morning. He had nodded once, distracted, as though whatever she was saying had already been agreed upon long before I heard a single word. At the time, I told myself it was nothing, just one of those small adjustments families make over time. But sitting there now, with my suitcase still out on that sidewalk for anyone to see, I realized those were not conversations. They were warnings. My phone buzzed again, and I glanced down, half expecting another message from Daniel, but it was a notification from the home security app one had not opened in months. The system had been updated. Access permissions had changed. I stared at the screen, my reflection faintly visible against the glass, and I felt something settle into place inside me, something cold and clear. They had not just changed the locks. They had erased me, carefully, methodically, as if I had never been part of that home at all. I leaned back in the driver's seat and closed my eyes for a second, not to escape, but to think. I could have driven back up the driveway. I could have knocked until someone answered. I could have demanded an explanation, forced a conversation they clearly did not want to have. But I did none of those things. Instead, I reached into my purse again and pulled out that document, the one I had carried for years out of habit more than necessity, and I unfolded it slowly, smoothing it across my lap. The numbers were still there. The signatures were still there. Everything exactly as it had been the day I signed it. Back when I believed that helping my son build a life meant I would always have a place in it. I let out a quiet breath, not heavy, not broken, just steady, and I started the engine. If they believed I would stand on that porch and beg to be let back in, they did not know me at all. And for the first time since I read that note, I realized something they had not considered. I still had choices, and they had just made the worst possible assumption about what I would do next. I drove for about 20 minutes before I realized I had not decided where I was going, just that I needed to be somewhere that was not that driveway, not that porch, not that door that no longer opened for me. And I ended up pulling into the parking lot of a small hotel just off the highway, the kind of place I had passed 100 times without ever imagining I would need it. The lobby was quiet, softly lit, and the woman at the front desk greeted me with a polite smile that did not ask questions, which was exactly what I needed. I asked for a room for a few nights, my voice steady, my tone calm, as if this were a simple stop along a longer journey instead of the result of being quietly removed from my own home. She handed me a key card, explained the breakfast hours, the Wi-Fi password, all the small details that make a place temporarily livable, and I nodded as though I were just another traveler passing through. When I stepped into the room, I set my purse down carefully on the desk and placed my suitcase by the bed, noticing how clean everything was, how neutral, how untouched by memory. There were no photographs here, no familiar sounds, no echoes of a life built over decades. Just a bed, a lamp, and a silence that felt different from the one in my car. This silence was not heavy. It was clear. I sat down on the edge of the bed and looked at my hands for a moment, then reached for my phone and opened my messages again, rereading Daniel's words as if there might be something hidden between them that I had missed the first time. "This is for the best, Mom." I tried to remember when he had started speaking like that, when his words began to sound less like his own and more like something practiced, something shaped by someone else. It had not happened all at once. It had been gradual, subtle, almost invisible if you were not looking for it. Fewer calls, shorter visits, decisions made without asking. I had told myself it was normal, that he was busy, that this was what life looked like when children grew into their own. But sitting there in that hotel room, I understood something I had been avoiding for a long time. This was not distance. This was removal, deliberate and precise. I stood up slowly and walked over to the desk, where I unfolded the document again, laying it flat under the soft yellow light. The ink had not faded. The signatures were still sharp, still undeniable. Years ago, when Daniel and Sophie had talked about buying that house, about building something stable, something lasting, I had stepped in without hesitation. I had told myself it was what any mother would do. I had transferred the money, signed the paperwork, trusted that what we were creating together would always include me. And for a long time, it had. Birthdays at the dining table, quiet mornings with coffee on the porch, evenings filled with small, ordinary conversations that felt like proof that everything was as it should be. Until it was not. I traced the edge of the paper with my finger, following the line where my name was written clearly, legally, permanently, and I felt that same steady clarity settle in again. They had changed the locks. They had rewritten the story, but they had not erased what was already documented, what was already mine in ways they clearly did not understand. I folded the paper once more, this time with intention, and placed it back into my purse. Then I reached for my phone, scrolled past Daniel's message without opening it again, and found a different contact. A name I had not needed in years, but one I had never deleted. I paused for just a second, my thumb hovering over the call button, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition. This was the moment things would begin to change. Then I pressed it. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered, steady and composed in a way that instantly brought me back to a time when things were handled with clarity instead of quiet manipulation. And when he said my name, there was no surprise in his tone, only recognition, as if he had always known that one day I might call. I told him where I was, keeping my voice even, giving only the necessary details, and he listened without interrupting, the way he always had when my husband was still alive and the two of them would sit for hours discussing contracts, plans, things that required patience and precision. When I finished, there was a brief pause, not uncomfortable, just thoughtful, and then he asked me a simple question that no one else had asked yet. Do you still have your copies? I looked down at my purse, resting on the edge of the desk, and answered honestly. Yes, all of them. There was a shift in his tone then, subtle but unmistakable, like a door opening somewhere I could not yet see. Good, he said, because that means nothing they did today changes what you have already secured. I did not respond right away, not because I did not understand, but because I wanted to hear him say it clearly, without assumption or interpretation. He explained it carefully, step by step, the way he always did, reminding me of things I had signed years ago, things I had trusted my husband to handle but had never truly been excluded from. The funds that were used to purchase the house, the structure of the transfer, the protections that had been quietly built into the agreement, not out of suspicion, but out of foresight. At the time, it had all felt unnecessary. Now, it felt like the only reason I was not standing on that sidewalk with nothing but a suitcase and a note. I moved to the window and looked out at the parking lot below, where cars came and went without anyone noticing who was arriving or leaving, and I realized how easily people assume permanence when everything around them appears stable. He asked me if I had been formally notified of anything, any legal change, any documented request for me to vacate, and I told him the truth. No, just a note on the door. He let out a quiet breath, not quite a laugh, but close enough to make the difference clear. Then they made a mistake, he said. A serious one. I felt something settle deeper inside me then. Not relief, not satisfaction, but certainty. The kind that does not come from emotion, but from understanding exactly where you stand. He told me to keep everything as it was, not to respond, not to engage, not to give them the opportunity to adjust their approach now that I was aware. Let them believe what they want for now, he said, and we will meet in the morning and go through everything properly. I agreed without hesitation, because for the first time since I had stepped out of my car and seen that suitcase on the sidewalk, I was no longer reacting. I was preparing. When the call ended, I placed the phone back on the desk and stood there for a moment, looking at my reflection in the window, noticing how calm I appeared, how steady my posture remained, as if nothing had happened at all. But something had happened. Not what they thought, not what they intended. They believed they had closed a door on me. What they did not realize yet was that they had just opened one I had never needed to use before. The next morning arrived without urgency, the lights slipping through the thin hotel curtains in a quiet, almost indifferent way, and for a moment I lay still, listening to the soft hum of the air conditioning, letting the stillness settle before I moved, because everything from this point forward required precision, not emotion. I got up slowly, dressed in the same calm routine I had followed for years, choosing simple, neutral clothes, nothing that suggested disruption, nothing that gave away what had shifted beneath the surface. When I stepped outside, the air was cooler than the day before, and the parking lot looked exactly the same, as if nothing significant had happened at all, which struck me as almost ironic. The world does not pause just because your place in it changes. I drove to the office he had asked me to meet him at, a building I had been to many times before, though it had been years since I last walked through those doors, and as I entered, I noticed how little had changed. The same polished floors, the same quiet professionalism, the same sense that everything here was built on structure, not assumption. He greeted me in the reception area with a nod, not overly warm, not distant, simply acknowledging that we were now moving into something that required clarity. We sat down in his office, and I placed my purse on the desk, taking out the documents one by one, laying them carefully in front of him. He reviewed them without rushing, his eyes moving steadily across each page, occasionally making a small note, occasionally pausing just long enough to confirm a detail. I watched him work, not asking questions, not interrupting, because I understood that what mattered now was not how I felt, but what could be proven. After a few minutes, he leaned back slightly and folded his hands, looking at me with a level of certainty that matched what I had begun to feel the night before. They assumed you would not look at any of this again, he said, his voice even, almost matter of fact, and they assumed you would react emotionally instead of legally. I nodded once, because that was exactly what they had expected. He explained the next steps clearly, outlining what could be done, what should be done, and more importantly, what should not be done. There would be no confrontation today, no calls, no messages. Everything would move through proper channels, documented, structured, undeniable. I listened carefully, committing each detail to memory, understanding that this was no longer about proving a point. It was about establishing reality. Before I left, he handed me a folder, neatly organized, each document placed in order, each step outlined with quiet precision. And as I took it, I felt that same calm certainty settle in again, deeper this time, stronger. When I stepped back outside, the sun had risen higher, the day fully underway, and for the first time since I had seen that suitcase on the sidewalk, I did not feel displaced. I felt positioned. They believed they had already decided the outcome. They believed the situation was finished. But as I walked to my car, holding that folder with steady hands, I understood something they had not yet realized. This was only the beginning, and this time, I would be the one deciding what happened next. The first message came just after noon, a short text from Daniel that appeared on my phone as I sat in a quiet corner of a coffee shop, the folder resting beside me like something far more valuable than it appeared on the surface, and I did not open it right away because I already knew what it would say before I even read it. When I finally looked down, the words were exactly what I expected, simple, controlled, carefully written to sound reasonable. Mom, we need to talk about boundaries. I read it once, then again, noticing the choice of words, the distance in the tone, the way it no longer sounded like a son speaking to his mother, but like someone repeating a script that had been handed to him. I did not respond. Instead, I placed the phone face down on the table and took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the bitterness settle, grounding myself in something real, something immediate. A few minutes later, another message appeared, this time from Sophie. We hope you understand this is what is best for everyone. I almost smiled at that, not out of amusement, but out of recognition. That phrase again, what is best for everyone? It sounded generous. It sounded thoughtful, but it was always used to justify decisions that only benefited the person saying it. I picked up my phone, read the message fully, and then set it back down without replying, because responding now would only give them something to adjust, something to work around. They still believed I was reacting. They still believed I was trying to understand. They had no idea that I had already moved past both of those stages. Around me, people continued their day without interruption, conversations overlapping, cups clinking softly against saucers, the steady rhythm of a world that did not know or care about the quiet shift that had taken place in mine. I opened the folder slowly, reviewing the documents again, not because I doubted them, but because I wanted every detail clear in my mind. Dates, signatures, transfers, everything aligned, everything documented in a way that did not rely on memory or interpretation. This was not about emotion anymore. This was about fact. My phone buzzed again, this time with a missed call notification, Daniel's name appearing on the screen, followed by a voicemail I chose not to listen to. Not yet. Timing mattered now. Every action, every response, every silence had a purpose. I closed the folder carefully and placed it back beside me, my hand resting on it for a moment longer than necessary, feeling the weight of it, not just as paper, but as proof. They had made their move quickly, assuming speed would prevent resistance, assuming I would be too shocked, too hurt, too unprepared to respond in any meaningful way. And for a brief moment, standing on that porch, I had been exactly what they expected. But that moment had passed. I stood up, leaving the empty cup behind, and walked toward the door with steady steps, my reflection briefly catching in the glass as I passed. Calm, composed, unchanged on the surface, but underneath, everything had shifted into place. They thought they were setting rules. They thought they were establishing control. What they did not realize yet was that they had already stepped into a situation they could not manage, and this time, I was not the one on the outside looking in. That afternoon, while the messages continued to arrive on my phone with increasing urgency, I chose a different kind of movement, one that did not involve responding, explaining, or defending, but instead involved quietly putting things in place that could not be undone once they were set. I drove to the bank branch I had used for years, the same one where my husband and I had sat across from a desk, and signed papers we barely discussed at the time because we trusted the future would unfold the way we intended. The building looked exactly the same: glass doors, polished floors, a calm efficiency that had nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with structure. When I stepped inside, I was greeted with the same polite professionalism, and I asked to speak with a manager, my voice even, my request simple. A few minutes later, I was seated in a quiet office, the door closed behind me, and I placed the folder on the desk, opening it carefully, each document positioned exactly where it needed to be. I explained what I needed, not in detail, not in a way that invited interpretation, but clearly enough that the implications were understood. The manager reviewed the documents, her expression neutral but attentive, and as she read, I watched the moment her posture shifted, subtle but unmistakable, when she realized what was actually in front of her. Accounts were verified, signatures confirmed, authority clarified. There was no confusion here, no room for assumption. Everything was documented long before anyone thought to challenge it. She asked me a few questions, each one precise, each one answered without hesitation, and when she finished, she nodded once, a small acknowledgement that the situation was now fully understood from her side. "We can proceed with your request," she said, her tone professional, but with an underlying respect that had not been there when I first walked in. I did not smile. I did not react outwardly at all. I simply agreed, signing where necessary, initialing where required, each motion deliberate, each line reinforcing something they had tried to ignore. Outside, the afternoon sun had shifted, casting longer shadows across the parking lot, and as I stepped back into my car, my phone buzzed again. Another call from Daniel, followed almost immediately by a message from Sophie, this one less composed than the others. "We need to sort this out now." I read it once and placed the phone back in my bag without replying, because now they were beginning to feel it, the change they could not yet see but were starting to sense. I started the engine and sat there for a moment, looking straight ahead, my hands steady on the wheel, understanding that what I had just done would not create noise, would not cause an immediate reaction, but it would begin something far more powerful. Quiet consequences, the kind that unfold without warning and cannot be reversed once they are in motion. They believed they had taken control with a lock and a note. What they did not understand yet was that control was never where they thought it was, and by the time they realized it, it would already be too late to take it back. By the time evening settled in, the tone of their messages had changed again, no longer controlled or carefully worded, but sharper, shorter, and edged with something they had not shown before, which told me more than any explanation ever could. I was sitting at the small desk in my hotel room, the folder open in front of me, reviewing the sequence of everything that had already been set into motion, when my phone lit up with another call from Daniel, followed immediately by a message that did not wait for a reply. "Mom, something is wrong with the accounts." I read it once, then placed the phone back down without reacting, letting the words settle in the quiet space around me. Because this was the moment when awareness begins, not understanding, not yet, but the first recognition that something is not unfolding the way it was expected to. A second message came in before I had even looked away. "We cannot access anything. Did you do something?" There was no accusation in the sentence, not directly, but there was urgency, confusion, and beneath that, the beginning of unease. I leaned back slightly in the chair, my hands resting calmly on the desk, and for a moment I simply listened to the silence of the room, the faint hum of electricity in the walls, the distant sound of a door closing somewhere down the hallway. Everything outside of this situation continued exactly as it always had. The only difference now was that they were starting to feel the shift I had already accepted. I did not answer. Not yet. Another call came through, this time from Sophie, and I watched it ring until it stopped, the screen going dark again as if nothing had happened, as if the urgency on the other end did not exist once I chose not to engage with it. I closed the folder slowly, aligning the edges of the papers with care, each movement deliberate, controlled, because what mattered now was not speed, but precision. They had acted quickly, assuming that control belonged to whoever moved first, whoever made the boldest decision, whoever created the most immediate disruption. But they had overlooked something fundamental. Control does not come from noise. It comes from structure, from documentation, from decisions made long before anyone realizes they will matter. My phone buzzed again, A new message appearing, this one longer, less composed. We need to talk tonight. This is getting out of hand. I read it without expression, then set the phone aside once more, because what they were experiencing now was not something that could be resolved with a conversation, not something that could be negotiated over a dinner table or softened with explanations. This was consequence, unfolding exactly as it had been set up to, even if they had never intended it to reach this point. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the dimly lit parking lot, where nothing had changed, where cars were still parked in neat rows, where people moved in and out without urgency, unaware of the quiet unraveling happening somewhere else entirely. I placed one hand lightly against the glass, not for support, but for focus, grounding myself in the stillness, and I allowed myself a single, steady breath. They had believed they were setting limits. They had believed they were defining my place. What they did not understand yet was that the moment they locked that door, they stepped into a situation where every move they made would lead them further away from the control they thought they had, and closer to a reality they were not prepared to face. The next morning, I did not wait for another message, another call, or another attempt to pull me into a conversation that was no longer necessary, because by then, everything that needed to be set in motion had already been done, and what remained was simply allowing it to unfold exactly as it was designed to. I arrived at the house just before noon, not early enough to suggest urgency, not late enough to suggest hesitation, and when I stepped out of the car, I noticed immediately that nothing about the exterior had changed. The same neatly trimmed lawn, the same quiet street, the same front door that had been so deliberately closed to me just one day before. For a moment, I stood at the edge of the driveway, not because I was unsure, but because I understood the significance of what was about to happen next, and then I walked forward, steady, measured, each step grounded in a certainty that no longer needed to be questioned. When I reached the door, I did not knock. I did not reach for the handle. Instead, I waited, because I knew they were already aware I was there. The curtain shifted slightly, just enough to confirm it, and a few seconds later, the door opened. Daniel stood there first, his expression strained, uncertain, as if he had been rehearsing what to say but had not expected this moment to arrive so soon. Sophie stood just behind him, her posture controlled, her eyes sharper than before, but there was something else there now, something less certain than the day before. "Mom," Daniel began, his voice careful, but I raised my hand slightly, not to silence him, but to pause what he was about to say, because whatever explanation they had prepared no longer held any weight in this moment. I stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, not as an act of defiance, but as a simple acknowledgement of something they had tried to deny. The house felt exactly the same and completely different at the same time, familiar in structure, unfamiliar in atmosphere, as if something had shifted beneath the surface that could not be undone by rearranging a few details. I placed my purse on the table and opened it slowly, taking out the folder and setting it down with the same care I had used every time before, and for a brief moment, no one spoke. The silence was not empty. It was full, heavy with everything that had been assumed, everything that had been overlooked. "You changed the locks," I said finally, my voice even, not accusing, not emotional, simply stating a fact that no longer needed explanation. Daniel nodded once, his gaze dropping for a second before returning to mine, and Sophie remained still, her eyes fixed on the folder as if she already understood what it contained. I opened it, turning the first document toward them, not rushing, not emphasizing, just allowing the reality of it to be seen clearly, without interpretation. "And this," I continued, "is what you forgot." I watched the shift happen in real time. The moment recognition replaced assumption, the moment certainty gave way to doubt, and for the first time since I had stood on that porch and read that note, I saw something they had not shown before. Not confidence, not control, but the realization that they had made a decision without understanding the full picture. I closed the folder gently, not with force, not with finality, but with quiet precision, and I looked at them both, not as someone asking for a place, but as someone who already knew exactly where she stood. They thought they had decided my future when they left my suitcase on that sidewalk. What they were only beginning to understand now was that they had just revealed theirs.